To the men in the black suits, Elias was a joke. A soft-handed academic in a tweed jacket, a man who spent his life buried in dusty archives and trembling at the sound of a creaking floorboard. They saw a librarian, a coward, a loose end easily snipped. So they didn't just kick down his door, they desecrated his sanctuary. They ransacked a dead soldier's memories, shattered the only piece an old woman had left, and put a bullet in her chest just to keep a 50-year-old lie buried. They thought they could butcher the truth and wash it away with blood. That was a fatal calculation. They forgot that the man reading the history books is the son of the warrior who survived the hell that wrote them. Elias stopped shaking the moment the glass shattered. The professor died in that alleyway and something primal took his place. They thought they were hunting a victim. They just woke up the war. The afternoon light, usually a benign bomb on the antique oak of Elias Vance's university office, felt sharp and intrusive as he stared at the package. It wasn't the usual academic fodder. No peer-reviewed journals, no advanced copies of forgotten histories. This one bore the seal of the Department of Defense, heavy with an unspoken weight, a posthumous formality delivered 6 months too late. Elias, a history professor specializing in 20th-century conflicts, had always found solace in the past, in the structured narratives of battlefields long dormant. His father's war, however, had remained a silent, unwritten chapter. Sergeant Major Arthur Vance had returned from Vietnam with a mind meticulously curated to forget, a silence impenetrable even to his own son. Now the government had finally sent its belated recognition. With a practiced, almost clinical detachment, Elias slit the tape. Inside, nestled on a bed of dark velvet, lay the bronze star. The metal glinted, a stark, uncomfortable beauty. He picked it up, feeling its cool weight, an award for heroism or meritorious service. He traced the raised eagle, the olive branch, the legend for heroism. It felt like holding a fragment of a ghost. His father, Arthur, an ordinary man to Elias, had lived a life Elias could only theorize about in lecture halls. Beneath the metal, wrapped in tissue paper, was something else. Not official documentation, but a thin, aged envelope. Elias's brow furrowed. He extracted it carefully. Inside was a single, faded photograph. It showed a dozen young men, impossibly young, their faces etched with a premature weariness. Jungle canopy, thick and suffocating, formed a backdrop. Mud-caked fatigues, rifles held loose, the kind of poses Elias had dissected countless times in textbooks. And there, in the center, a younger version of his father, gaunt, eyes too old for his face, but with a fierce, almost defiant spark. Above the cluster of shoulders, a crudely stenciled sign read, Echo Company. Elias's thumb brushed against the brittle surface. A tremor, barely perceptible, ran through him. This was not merely a historical artifact. It was a personal relic, saturated with the raw, untamed essence of a past he had never been allowed to touch. As he turned the photograph over, something else slipped out, a small, folded piece of paper, the edges softened by time. The paper was cheap, almost pulpy, and on it, written in a cramped, almost furious script that didn't belong to his father, were 3 words. They wouldn't be here without her. The air in the office seemed to thicken, the benign afternoon light now casting long, unsettling shadows. Elias stared at the note, then at the faces in the photograph. Her. Who was her? And what did "wouldn't be here" mean? Survival? Existence? The casual, almost accusatory tone of the anonymous message sent a cold tendril of unease coiling in his gut. This wasn't a tribute, it was a confession or perhaps a condemnation. His historian's mind, usually so adept at piecing together disparate facts, felt suddenly overwhelmed. This wasn't a puzzle from a century ago. This was an immediate, visceral mystery tied to his own flesh and blood. He remembered the boxes in the attic, untouched since his father's funeral, overflowing with the detritus of a life carefully compartmentalized. Specifically, he remembered a leather-bound journal, a slim volume his father had kept close but never discussed. Elias had skimmed it once, finding it mostly filled with gardening notes and weather observations, mundane entries that had seemed disappointing at the time. Now a spark ignited. He wrapped the bronze star, the photo, and the mysterious note back into the official box. The academic day was over, but the quiet rhythm of his life had just been violently disrupted. By the time Elias reached his secluded Victorian home, nestled among ancient oaks on the quieter edge of town, dusk was painting the sky in bruised purples and oranges. The house, usually a sanctuary of scholarly calm, felt different. A faint prickling sensation, a shift in the ambient quiet, nudged at the back of his mind. He dismissed it as the lingering effect of the day's unsettling discovery. He made his way to the attic, the heavy wooden stairs groaning beneath his weight. Dust motes danced in the lone bulb's glow as he rummaged through crates of forgotten photographs and tax documents until his fingers brushed against the familiar texture of aged leather. His father's journal. Back downstairs, in the hushed intimacy of his study, Elias settled into his worn armchair, the journal open on his lap. The initial entries were indeed mundane, rainfall figures, planting schedules. But as he delved deeper, skipping forward past the predictable entries, he found them. Scrawled in a frantic hand Elias hadn't recognized as his father's, almost buried between entries on rose pruning and the price of fertilizer, were fragmented thoughts, raw and unedited. April 12, 69. The letters, it's getting worse. They know. She knows. May 3, 69. Can't trust anyone. The postmistress. Is she watching? June 1, 69. If they find out about the letters, we're all dead. All of us. Elias's breath caught in his throat. The letters. The postmistress. The words resonated with a terrifying force, echoing the anonymous note he'd found with the photograph. They wouldn't be here without her. It wasn't just a question of who she was, but what she had done, and what secret bound his father's wartime past to a contemporary, terrifying urgency. His analytical mind raced, piecing together a terrifying, invisible conspiracy. A floorboard creaked upstairs. Elias froze. His ears strained, dissecting the silence. It wasn't the familiar groan of an old house settling. It was a distinct, deliberate sound. A thud followed by a muffled clang. His heart hammered against his ribs. He lived alone. He rose slowly, the journal slipping from his lap to the carpet. Every nerve ending screamed. He grabbed the antique brass letter opener from his desk, a pathetic weapon, but the only one within reach. He moved through the silent house, each step an agony of suspense, the air growing colder, heavier. The study door, which he'd left slightly ajar, was now wide open, revealing the living room. The room was not ransacked, not in the way a common burglar would have done it. The expensive electronics were untouched. The silver heirlooms on the mantelpiece remained. But the antique globe had been tipped over, its stand splintered. The cushions on the sofa were askew. And there on the coffee table was the Bronze Star box. It was open. Its contents, the metal, the faded photograph, and the anonymous note, were scattered across the polished wood, proof of an invasive, desperate search. Nothing seemed to be missing. Only searched. But for what? The specific violence done to the box, the meticulous disarray of only its contents, confirmed his worst fear. Someone hadn't been looking for valuables. They had been looking for something in that box. Something specific. Something connected to the note, to the journal, to the terrifying ghost of Echo Company. He stepped back, his hand shaking, the letter opener suddenly feeling impossibly heavy. The adrenaline coursed through him, sharpening his senses. The smell of cold air, the faintest trace of old cologne, not his own. The faint scuff mark on the pristine oak floor near the window, a sliver of broken glass from the latch. Someone had been here. Someone had violated his sanctuary, his peace, specifically for this. And they knew he had it. Or at least they knew his father had it. Elias looked from the rifled box to the cryptic journal entries. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to connect, forming a picture far more sinister than any war history he had ever studied. His father's secrets, once safely entombed, had just clawed their way into the present, dragging him into a dangerous past he knew nothing about. He was no longer just a history professor. He was a target. And the terrifying question wasn't what they wanted, but who she was and what untold truth lay buried beneath the faded faces of Echo Company, a truth powerful enough to kill for. The cold air from the still broken window pane brought no comfort, only the stark reality of the violation. Elias, though his hands still trembled, felt a familiar resolve calcifying within him. Fear was a potent stimulant, but so was indignation. His sanctuary had been defiled. His father's memory, once a quiet comfort, now pulsed with a dangerous, urgent energy. He wasn't just grieving a father, he was inheriting a war. And as any good historian knew, the first casualty of war was truth. He spent the next 48 hours submerged, the outside world fading into an irrelevant hum. His study, once a haven of quiet scholarship, became a war room. The rifled box sat open, its contents a breadcrumb trail. The worn leather journal, the faded photographs, the cryptic note, each a piece of a puzzle that threatened to consume him. Echo Company. The name echoed hollow and ominous. The digital archives of military history were vast, a labyrinth of heroic narratives and sanitized casualty reports. Elias, a veteran navigator of these digital seas, began his deep dive. Public records for Echo Company, deployed to a particularly brutal sector during an anachronistic, undeclared conflict, were sparse but consistent. Standard operational procedures. Commendations. Casualties listed but always vague. He cross-referenced names, dates, battalion movements. He hunted for anomalies, for the discordant note in the chorus of official history. And then he found it. Not a single red flag but a constellation of them. The survival rate. He double-checked his calculations, cross-referenced them with similar units operating in the same theaters, under comparable conditions. It was impossibly high. Not just low casualties, but an almost perfect record of extraction for the majority of its members. While other companies were decimated, Echo Company seemed to dance through the maelstrom, emerging largely unscathed. It wasn't just unusual, it was statistically improbable. A ghost in the machine of military data. What kind of unit, engaged in clandestine operations in a hostile environment, could maintain such an immaculate record? Unless, of course, their operations were not what they seemed. Or their records were meticulously curated. His historian's instinct screamed, cover up. Not just a failure to report, but an active, deliberate concealment of the true nature of their deployments. The implications chilled him more than the draft from the window. What kind of mission, what kind of truth would require such a profound silence? Armed with a partial roster culled from archived commendations and a few faded group photos from his father's box, Elias began the arduous task of contacting survivors. It was a disheartening grind. Numbers disconnected. Addresses outdated, leading to empty lots or bewildered new residents. Some names yielded no public records whatsoever, as if the men had simply evaporated from existence after their service. The digital trail was not just cold, it was obliterated. This wasn't merely bad record-keeping, it felt intentional. After days of fruitless searching, a tremor of hope or perhaps dread stirred. He found a recent obituary not for a member of Echo, but for a man listed as a close friend and former colleague of a Sergeant Arthur Jenkins, a confirmed member of Echo Company from his father's journal. A quick search yielded a phone number for Jenkins, surprisingly current, in a sleepy coastal town hundreds of miles away. Elias dialed, his heart thudding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. A raspy, hesitant voice answered, thick with age and the subtle crackle of a lifetime of cigarettes. Jenkins. Sergeant Jenkins? Elias began carefully, my name is Elias Vance. I'm Professor Vance. I'm calling about Echo Company. My father, Captain Robert Vance, served with you. A sharp intake of breath on the other end. Then silence. A long, drawn-out moment where the air crackled with unspoken history. Captain Vance, Jenkins finally rasped, the name tasting like ash. He's gone. Yes, sir. My apologies. He passed away some years ago. I'm trying to understand a few things about his service, about Echo Company. There's a journal, some inconsistencies in the official records, AA feeling that there's more to the story. Elias pushed, perhaps too eagerly, too quickly. The old man's voice hardened, losing its initial frailty. Inconsistencies? What would a young professor like you know about inconsistencies, son? You weren't there. You didn't see what we saw. The words were clipped, laced with an anger that felt too raw, too recent for events decades old. I'm just trying to piece together my father's life, Sergeant. He left behind some things that suggest. Suggest what? Jenkins cut him off, a tremor in his voice that was not of age, but of something deeper, something akin to fear. That we were heroes? Or villains? Does it matter now? It matters to me. There was a break-in at my home recently. Someone was looking for something connected to his time in Echo. A note mentioning a woman, she. Elias let the word hang in the air, a deliberate provocation. The effect was immediate. A choked sound. A sharp, almost painful exhale. You need to stop digging, son. The voice was a low growl now, a physical threat barely contained. Some things are buried for a reason. Then a click. The line went dead. Elias stared at his phone, the silence on his end suddenly deafening, amplifying the veteran's chilling words. The wall wasn't just silent, it was actively pushing back. The encounter left Elias shaken but resolute. Jenkins's fear, palpable even through the phone line, confirmed it. There was something dangerous. He needed to understand. He needed to find a different kind of solace, a different kind of answer. His gaze drifted to a framed photograph on his desk. His father, young, uniformed, smiling. The stoic, enigmatic figure who had raised him, now a specter of secrets. Elias knew where he had to go next. To the one place he could still feel a connection, however tenuous, however fraught. The cemetery was quiet, the winter air crisp and smelling of damp earth and distant pine. Elias walked the familiar path, the crunch of gravel under his boots the only sound. His father's headstone stood sentinel, stark gray granite against the muted landscape. He'd visited countless times, brought flowers, spoken silent words, wrestled with the unresolved grief of a son who never truly knew the man his father became after the war. Today the visit felt different. Not a pilgrimage of mourning, but of interrogation. He stood before the stone, the engraved name Robert Vance, stark beneath the epitaph. A loving husband and father, a brave soldier. A hollow ache settled in his chest. Brave soldier, he thought, or something else. What did you bury, Dad? What have you dragged me into? His fingers traced the cold, smooth surface of the stone, moving from the chiseled letters to the unadorned back. He paused. Something was off. He ran his fingertips again, slower this time. There, on the lower edge, almost obscured by a patch of moss and weathered gray lichen, was an irregularity. It wasn't a natural crack, nor the random pitting of age. It was deliberate. Shallow, almost imperceptible to the casual glance, but undeniable to the seeking touch. He squatted, clearing away the moss with a thumbnail, rubbing the dirt-stained granite. As the lichen flaked away, the shape emerged. It was small, no bigger than his thumbprint, etched with remarkable precision. Two interlocking triangles, one upright, one inverted, forming a six-pointed star, but not quite. The lines were fluid, almost organic, with a small, stylized eye at the center where the points converged. It wasn't a Star of David, nor any standard military insignia he knew. It was ancient, yet modern, geometric, yet esoteric. A glyph. A mark. A symbol. Elias stared at it, a cold dread blossoming in his chest. He had seen this symbol before, or something strikingly similar. Where? His mind raced, pulling at threads of memory. It was from his father's journal, sketched in the margins of a particularly cryptic entry, nestled between a coded date and a single, chilling word, Orpheus. The symbol on the headstone wasn't just a random carving. It was a key. A secret message hidden in plain sight for decades. But what lock did it open? And who else knew it was there? He felt a chill that had nothing to do with the winter air. His father hadn't just buried secrets, he'd left a map. And now, Elias was standing at the threshold of a truth far more dangerous than he could have ever imagined. The symbol, no bigger than his thumbprint, had consumed Elias. He'd spent the remainder of the afternoon and all night hunched over his father's journal, his own cryptic notes, and a scattered array of esoteric texts he'd pulled from the dustier corners of his study. The twin triangles, the stylized eye, it vibrated with a forgotten language, a silent hum of purpose that gnawed at his intellect. His father, Arthur Thorne, a man of profound intellect and even profounder secrets, had never been one for conventional communication. His journals were a labyrinth of misdirection, philosophical musings, and coded ciphers. Elias remembered now a particularly obscure volume his father cherished, The Forgotten Cartographies, Unofficial American Mail Routes 1890 to 1945. It was a niche academic curiosity, a tome on how clandestine groups, from labor unions to wartime saboteurs, devised their own postal networks outside government purview. He found it buried under a pile of World War I memoirs. Flipping through its brittle pages, he stopped at an appendix illustrating various shadow postmarks and route markers. And there it was. Not identical but horrifyingly close. A specific variant of the symbol, detailed as a marker for a short-lived, deeply covert operation during the Korean War, referenced only as Project Orpheus. The accompanying text described it as a geographical designator, its lines and points corresponding to a grid overlay, hinting at a specific postal district. Elias's hands trembled as he followed the faded instructions, cross-referencing the symbol's geometry with an old topographical map of the eastern seaboard tucked inside the book's back cover. The central eye, he realized, indicated the centroid of a region. The interlocking triangles denoted a range of latitude and longitude. It took hours of painstaking calculation, the early winter sun bleeding through his window, then fading into twilight again. Finally, a sequence of numbers and letters coalesced. NC 28723. A North Carolina postal code. A specific, remote, forgotten corner of the Appalachian foothills. Not a home address, but a postal district. The kind of place where a network of clandestine letters like those from Echo Company might have found a central hub, a forgotten nexus. The drive was long, a descent from the intellectual chaos of his study into the raw, unpolished heart of the country. Interstate highways gave way to state roads, then narrow, winding two-lane blacktops that climbed and dipped through dense forests. The air grew colder, the light thinner. Civilization thinned with it. Cell service winked out. Gas stations became fewer, their signs faded, their pumps ancient. He found it just as dusk began to paint the sky in bruised purples and grays. The town of Blackwood Creek was barely a cluster of 3 buildings: a general store with a sagging porch, a church with a leaning steeple, and the post office. It stood apart, a small, clapboard structure painted a color that might once have been white, now a mottled gray. Its windows were grimy, its mailbox a rusted maw, and the sign above the door, once proudly proclaiming U.S. Post Office, was missing several letters, leaving a cryptic U.S. Post FFIC. Inside, the air was stale, thick with the scent of old paper and dust. A single fluorescent tube hummed overhead, casting a sickly yellow light on the scarred wooden counter. Behind it, a woman with hair like spun steel and eyes like chips of flint watched him approach. She wasn't elderly, perhaps late 50s, but she had the weary, watchful look of someone who had seen too many decades of slow decline. "Can I help you?" Her voice was raspy, laced with suspicion. "Yes, I'm looking for Jedediah Stone," Elias said, trying to project a casual confidence he didn't feel. "Jed Stone." Her eyes narrowed. "What for?" "I am a researcher," he began, hoping it sounded convincing. "I'm looking into some old military service records." "He was a ranger, I believe." She stared at him, unblinking. "Jed don't see many visitors. Especially not from the city." Her gaze lingered on his expensive jacket, his relatively clean hands. "He's particular." "It's important," Elias pressed. "It concerns his past service. Echo Company." The name hung in the air, a palpable shift in the dusty silence. The woman's lips thinned. "You got no business with Jed Stone's past," she finally said, her voice low and edged with warning. "Leave him be." "Please," Elias insisted, pushing a $20 bill across the counter. "It's a matter of closure. For some families." He softened his voice, making it sound more human, less academic. She eyed the money, then him, then the money again. With a sigh that seemed to carry the weight of the mountains, she finally pointed a gnarled finger toward the window. "Take the old logging road behind the church. Follow it till it ends. You'll know the place." Her gaze hardened again. "But don't say I sent ya. And don't go pestering him. He's earned his peace." The logging road was a series of mud ruts and exposed roots. Elias's sedan, more accustomed to paved urban streets, groaned in protest. The forest pressed in, ancient and indifferent. Finally, the path ended at a clearing dominated by a ramshackle cabin, a plume of smoke curling lazily from its stone chimney. A battered pickup truck, ancient and rusting, sat nearby. As Elias stepped out of his car, a figure emerged from the cabin's shadows. Jedediah Stone. Even from a distance, the ranger's silhouette was formidable. Tall, broad-shouldered, with a slight stoop that spoke of age, not weakness. He held a rifle, a hunting-grade bolt-action, with the casual familiarity of a man born with one in his hands. "You're on private property." Jed's voice was a gravelly growl, each word chipped from stone. He didn't raise the rifle, but its presence was undeniable. "Mr. Stone? My name is Elias Thorne. I'm sorry to trespass, but I need to speak with you." Elias kept his hands visible, his movements slow and deliberate. Jed didn't respond, just watched him with eyes like chips of granite, sizing him up, dissecting him. The silence stretched, heavy and menacing. "It's about Echo Company," Elias ventured, trying to bridge the gap. "About your service." A flicker of something, anger? Pain? Crossed Jed's face. "My service is done. Been done for 50 years. You got no business here, Thorne. Turn around." "My father knew your company," Elias pressed, desperation tinging his voice. "He was involved in Project Orpheus. It was a gamble, a shot in the dark, but it was the only link he had." Jed froze. The rifle, which had been resting against his hip, lifted fractionally. "What did you say?" His voice was a low rumble, dangerous. "Project Orpheus," Elias repeated, holding his ground. He reached slowly into his pocket, pulling out his wallet, careful to avoid any sudden movements that might be misinterpreted. From a concealed flap, He extracted the small laminated photograph he'd taken of the symbol on the headstone. He held it out, letting the last light catch its intricate lines. Jed's gaze fell upon the image. The rifle lowered, slowly, almost imperceptibly. His eyes, though still sharp, seemed to lose some of their hard edge, replaced by a profound weariness, a haunted recognition. He took a step forward, then another, until he was close enough to see the photograph clearly. He stared at the symbol, his face a mask of conflicting emotions. "Where did you get this?" The question was barely a whisper. "It was on a headstone," Elias explained, his own voice softening. "A man named William Maxwell. It was in the family plot with my father." Jed nodded slowly, a ghost of a memory playing across his features. "Maxwell. Good man. Too good for what they did to him." He lowered the rifle completely, resting its butt on the ground. He turned, gesturing for Elias to follow him to a couple of rough-hewn logs that served as seats near a smoldering fire pit. Elias sat, his heart thumping against his ribs. He felt the weight of decades of unspoken history pressing down on them. Jed stared into the embers. That symbol that was hers. Her mark. He paused, taking a deep, shuddering breath. They called her Oracle. Elias leaned forward, a torrent of questions forming in his mind. Oracle? Who was she? Jed finally looked at him, his eyes distant, seeing something far beyond the flickering firelight. A woman. Not one of us, not officially. But she was part of it. The brains of the operation in many ways. She knew things. Things she shouldn't have known. Things nobody but Command was supposed to know. His voice dropped to a conspiratorial whisper. She could see patterns, connect dots nobody else could. Almost like she could predict the future. And that made some very powerful people very nervous. The air crackled with a new kind of tension, the quiet hum of a conspiracy taking root. "What kind of things?" Elias asked, barely breathing. Jed shook his head, a bitter smile twisting his lips. Things that contradicted the official narrative. Things that showed just how dirty their hands were. They wanted the Oracle silenced. Badly. He looked up, his gaze piercing. "And if you're digging this up, Thorn, then they still do. You hear me? Powerful people. The kind that don't leave witnesses." A twig snapped in the forest behind them, crisp and sudden, cutting through the twilight hush. Jed's head whipped around, his old ranger instincts instantly alert. His hand instinctively went for the rifle. Elias felt a prickle of ice down his spine. He hadn't heard a sound, but Jed's reaction was immediate, visceral. Someone was out there. Someone was listening. Jed's eyes, suddenly cold and hard again, met Elias's. "You just drew a target on your back, son. And it ain't just shadows you're hunting anymore." The forest exhaled as Elias departed Jed's secluded cabin, the twilight deepening around him like a shroud. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig, was amplified, transformed into a potential threat. Jed's words, sharp and cold, echoed in his ears. "You just drew a target on your back, son." The invisible eyes Jed had sensed felt disturbingly real now, a phantom presence following him through the winding dirt roads. He drove, windows up, the air conditioner blasting, as if the manufactured chill could somehow freeze the fear seeping into his bones. The vast, anonymous darkness of the North Carolina countryside pressed in, a stark contrast to the controlled chaos of urban life he was accustomed to. He was no longer just an investigative journalist, he was a quarry. He found Agnes Dubois 2 days later, after a winding journey into the forgotten corners of the state. Her house was less a dwelling, more a monument to solitude, nestled deep within a thicket of overgrown pines and weeping willows, a mile down a gravel track that seemed to dissolve into wild undergrowth. The paint on its clabbered siding peeled like sunburnt skin, and the porch sagged under the weight of decades. A faint, earthy scent, damp soil, decaying leaves, and something faintly herbal clung to the air. No manicured lawn, no cheerful flowers, just nature slowly reclaiming its own. As Elias stepped onto the creaking porch, the floorboards groaning in protest, he felt a strange tremor of apprehension. This wasn't just a house, it was a sanctuary, perhaps even a tomb where memories lay buried. He knocked, the sound surprisingly loud in the profound silence. He waited. A long, drawn-out moment stretched, marked only by the buzzing of unseen insects. He raised his hand to knock again when the door finally opened a crack. A pair of eyes, the color of rich, dark earth, met his through the narrow gap. They were ancient, clouded by a film of time and sorrow, yet surprisingly sharp, like polished obsidian. Agnes Dubois stood before him, a slender woman whose frame seemed too fragile for the burdens those eyes suggested. Her skin, a mosaic of wrinkles, spoke of a life lived under a relentless sun, and her silver hair, pulled back in a severe bun, seemed to absorb all ambient light. She wore a simple, faded house dress, and her hands, gnarled with age, clutched the doorframe. "Mr. Thorne?" Her voice was raspy, like dry leaves scuttering across pavement. "Du Bois, yes. Elias Thorne. I'm here about the letters. From the old post office in '68. He kept his tone gentle, respectful. A flicker of fear, resignation, crossed her face. The door opened wider, revealing a shadowy hallway leading into a dim living room heavy with the scent of old paper and dust. "I don't recall any letters, young man. I worked the mail, stamped the envelopes. That's all." Her tone was flat, final. She hadn't invited him in, but she hadn't entirely closed the door on him either. Elias saw the pain behind her dismissive words. This wasn't a lack of memory, it was a wall built brick by painful brick over half a century. "My father, Captain Arthur Thorne, served in Vietnam. I believe his name might have come up in connection with some of those letters." He watched her closely, searching for any tell. Her gaze, previously fixed on some distant point beyond him, snapped back. For a brief instant, a raw, exposed emotion, grief, perhaps, or anger, flashed in her eyes. But it was gone, replaced by the same weary emptiness. A great many men served. A great many names passed through that post office. I saw them all come and go, in and out of those envelopes. She shifted her weight, a subtle signal of dismissal. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I have my supper to prepare." Defeat washed over Elias. He had come so far, felt so close, only to be met by an impenetrable silence. Jed had said she knew things, that she was the Oracle, but this woman was a ghost, haunted by echoes she refused to acknowledge. He began to turn, his shoulders slumping. "Thank you for your time, Ms. Du Bois." He was halfway down the first step when her voice, thin but suddenly sharp, cut through the quiet. "Did your father ever speak of the coordinates for the secondary extraction point during Operation Hummingbird?" Elias froze, his heart hammering against his ribs. He turned slowly, his breath caught in his throat. Operation Hummingbird. It was a name burned into the very few classified documents he had managed to access about his father's final tour. An obscure, small-scale infiltration mission, officially declared a minor success despite heavy casualties. The details were scarce, almost scrubbed. But the secondary extraction point? That was a detail only someone with intimate, almost operational-level knowledge would possess. Or someone who had meticulously pieced together scraps of information, finding patterns no one else could. Agnes Du Bois stepped fully onto the porch, her eyes, no longer veiled by sadness, now held a flinty, challenging glint. The one off-grid, west of the designated LZ. The one that was never meant to be used. The one that was deliberately obscured in the official reports. The air crackled. This wasn't just memory, this was revelation. The true nature of her oracle ability crystallized in Elias's mind. It wasn't mystic prophecy, it was intellect, meticulous observation, and a profound, devastating empathy for the men whose lives were being manipulated. How do you know that?" Elias managed, his voice barely a whisper. A bitter, humorless smile touched her lips, deepening the lines around her mouth. "Because I read it. Not in a single letter, young man. But in dozens. Hundreds. The ones they thought were just personal correspondence. The ones that came back from the field, sometimes barely decipherable, sometimes full of coded pain, sometimes from the families asking why their boy hadn't written in weeks." She paused, her gaze locking onto his, intense and unwavering. "They called me the Oracle because I saw the patterns. I saw the lies." Her voice gained strength, the decades of suppressed truth finally breaking free. "Operation Hummingbird. It wasn't an infiltration, Mr. Thorne. It was an experiment. A test of something heinous. They sent men in, including your father's platoon, not to achieve a strategic objective, but to observe reactions. To test a new kind of demoralization. A psychological weapon that left men shattered, unable to fight, but still alive, enough to walk away if they were lucky." Elias felt a cold dread spread through him, colder than any fear of surveillance. An experiment? What kind of experiment? Agnes shook her head, her face etched with a pain that seemed fresh, raw. The kind that makes you question everything you thought was righteous about that war. The kind that turns soldiers into lab rats. Your father, Captain Thorne, he found out. He saw the truth behind the official cover story, behind the carefully curated reports. He saw what they were doing to those men. And he tried to warn people. He tried to expose it. A chilling thought struck Elias. Jed had warned him about powerful people who don't leave witnesses. If his father knew. He wrote about it, Agnes continued, her eyes glistening. Not explicitly, of course. He knew better. But he left clues, woven into seemingly innocuous messages to his family, to his trusted comrades. Details about that secondary extraction point, about specific dates, about a peculiar kind of haze that fell over the men. He wanted someone, anyone, to understand. And I was the one who listened. She stepped closer, her voice dropping to a fierce whisper, her gnarled hand reaching out, briefly touching his arm. Your father didn't die a hero in some glorious battle, Mr. Thorne. He died because he had uncovered a profound betrayal within the ranks of his own command. He was silenced. And the proof that condemned them all, it exists. It's in his letters. The ones they thought I just processed and passed on. A shiver of profound horror and dawning understanding ran through Elias. His father, a whistleblower. His death, not an accident of war but murder. He stared at Agnes, the quiet clerk who had seen too much, understood too much. They are still looking for it, you understand? Agnes's grip tightened on his arm, her eyes wide with urgency. The letters? They always knew someone might have figured it out. And if you're asking about them now, it means they know you're getting close. They want to bury it once and for all. And they will bury you with it just like they buried Arthur. But they don't know the truth about what happened to the letters, not really. They don't know where the real proof is hidden. She leaned in, her voice barely audible. They don't know I kept them, Mr. Thorne. All of them. And that I finally figured out the last piece of your father's code only a few months ago. The key to everything is in his final letter. And it implicates someone still very much alive. Someone very powerful. Elias stood frozen, the phantom touch of Agnes's hand burning against his arm. The air in the shadowed parlor, already thick with dust and unspoken histories, now vibrated with the enormity of her confession. His father was murdered. The proof exists. She kept it all. You kept them? Elias's voice was a raw whisper, barely audible over the thrumming in his ears. The letters? My father's letters? Agnes retreated slightly, her eyes, though clouded with age, held a fierce, unwavering light. She moved with a purpose Elias hadn't noticed before, a contained energy belying her frail appearance. She walked to an old, tarnished silver tea set on a small table, picked up a damp cloth, and meticulously began polishing a spoon, her movements slow, deliberate, a nervous tick belying her outward calm. The scraping of metal on metal was the only sound for a long moment, a stark counterpoint to the unspoken chaos. Not just his letters, Mr. Thorne, she finally said, her voice now softer, more distant, as if recounting a dream. All of them. The ones that spoke without speaking. The ones that screamed when they were meant to whisper. She set the spoon down, a glint of defiance in her gaze. But before I tell you where or why, you must understand how I came to know what I know. What I did. She gestured towards the worn armchair opposite her own. Elias sank into it, his legs suddenly weak. He watched her, a woman who had lived a quiet life on the periphery, now revealing herself as a sentinel standing guard over buried truths. Agnes settled back, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, the silver spoon forgotten. I never went to university, Mr. Thorne. My schooling ended early. But I had a certain aptitude. For patterns. For logic. My father, God rest him, used to say I could find a needle in a haystack blindfolded, just by knowing how hay behaves. When I started at the post office, it was like being given 1,000 haystacks a day. Her gaze drifted to the window, where the last slivers of twilight were being swallowed by an encroaching, unnatural darkness. Every letter, every parcel, every official communique that passed through this town, passed through my hands. I learned the rhythm of communication, the subtle shifts in tone when news was bad, the unspoken anxieties tucked between the lines of a cheerful postcard. I taught myself to read not just the words but the spaces between them. The postal codes, the return addresses, the dates. They were all pieces of a larger puzzle. A shiver ran down Elias's spine. He was listening to the reluctant oracle of a forgotten war. Then came the drafts, Agnes continued, her voice tightening perceptibly. And with them my brother Thomas. He was so young, so full of spirit. 18. He was assigned to Echo Company. And that's when the letters started to change. Her eyes, now fixed on Elias, held a profound sorrow, edged with a flicker of old fear. I began to notice things. Small things at first. A letter from a wife to her husband in Echo Company, talking about a cold snap, despite it being the height of summer. Another from a mother, asking if her son had received the new boots she'd sent, when I knew she'd sent food parcels. Seemingly innocuous, but they jarred against the official reports of morale and conditions I also handled. She leaned forward, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. I realized they were using codes. Civilian codes, born of necessity and love, meant to slip past censors. But I was the censor in a way. And I started to cross-reference them with the local military mail. Dispatches from command, supply requisitions, troop movements. It was like two separate narratives were unfolding. One, an official story of a well-supplied, victorious campaign. The other, pieced together from wives' anxious pleas and mothers' subtle warnings, painted a picture of dire shortages, reckless orders, and escalating casualties for Echo Company specifically. Elias felt a cold knot form in his stomach. This wasn't just observation. This was an active investigation. They were being sacrificed, Agnes murmured, her voice raw with conviction. Echo Company. They were being deliberately put in harm's way, given impossible orders, denied crucial support. And I knew Thomas was among them. My little brother, who always brought me wildflowers. Her eyes glistened, but no tears fell. I couldn't just stand by, Mr. Thorne. Not with Thomas there. Not with so many sons and husbands. Here it was. The controversial core. So I acted, she stated, her chin lifting defiantly. I used my position. I started redirecting letters. Not randomly. I ensured that letters containing veiled warnings from families of Echo Company soldiers found their way to other companies' families. I thought, if enough people saw the patterns, if enough people started to question, then someone higher up might listen. Elias's breath hitched. This was beyond what he could have imagined. She was a silent saboteur, a ghost in the machine. I also delayed some official communications, Agnes confessed, her gaze unwavering. Orders that I knew from my deciphered warnings would send Echo Company into an avoidable ambush. Supply requests that were being deliberately ignored, misplaced, or rerouted, until they became too critical to ignore. It was small acts, Mr. Thorne. Tiny adjustments to the flow of information. But sometimes a ripple can become a wave. Her actions, Elias realized with a jolt, were not merely unethical, they were treasonous by the strict letter of the law. Yet, her motivation, her desperate attempt to save lives, painted a complex, morally ambiguous picture. She was a whistleblower, yes, but also a covert operative, an agent of chaos in the postal service. And the anonymous letters? Elias pressed, needing to connect her story to his father's. My doing, she admitted, a shadow of weariness crossing her face. I crafted them. After I realized the civilian codes weren't enough, and my redirecting only created confusion, I tried a more direct approach. I used what I knew, the patterns, the codes, the truth. I sent them to officials, to journalists, to anyone I thought might have the power to intervene. I made them coded too, hoping to bypass the initial dismissals. I wrote warnings about misplaced loyalties, about sacrifices made for profit, about wolves in sheep's clothing. I tried to sound the alarm without exposing myself. And my father? Elias asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Arthur Thorne. What did he uncover that made him a target for these same wolves? Agnes's eyes narrowed, a cold fire replacing the earlier sorrow. Your father was an intelligent man, Mr. Thorne. A good man. He was high enough in command to see the entire picture, not just the fragments I pieced together from letters. He began to investigate the extraordinary casualty rates of Echo Company. He saw the discrepancies in official records, the falsified reports. He saw the threads I tried to weave with my warnings, and he pulled on them. She paused, taking a slow, shaky breath. He started communicating with me through his letters. Not directly, of course. But he knew somehow that I was listening. He understood the language of the spaces too. He confirmed my fears. He gathered the definitive proof. Proof that didn't just implicate negligent command, but deliberate, calculated betrayal. A conspiracy that extended far beyond the battlefield. A conspiracy rooted in greed, Mr. Thorne. Pure, unadulterated greed at the cost of human lives. The revelation hit Elias like a physical blow. Greed. Not just strategic blunders or incompetence, but malicious, intentional sacrifice for profit. The darkness Agnes spoke of was not merely the absence of light, but an active, consuming malevolence. And the powerful person? Elias pressed, a chill spreading through him. The one still alive? Agnes's gaze hardened, locking onto Elias's. The architect. The one who orchestrated it all, who signed off on the orders that condemned Echo Company. Your father's final letter, the one I finally deciphered, it names him. It lays bare his entire scheme. And it exposes the deep roots of his power, roots that still hold this entire region captive. Roots that will crush anyone who threatens to expose them. She stood up, her frail frame radiating an unexpected strength. She walked over to a heavy wooden desk in the corner, her fingers trailing over its dusty surface. They searched this house, Mr. Thorne, years ago. After your father's death. They knew someone had a copy or knew too much. They never found anything. Because they didn't know what they were looking for. And they certainly didn't know where to look. Agnes reached beneath the desk, her fingers fumbling with something hidden from view. A soft click echoed in the silence. Elias watched, his heart pounding, as she pulled out a false bottom. Inside lay a small leather-bound satchel, looking surprisingly pristine despite the age of its hiding place. This is it, she whispered, her voice barely audible. Everything. The coded warnings, the altered documents, the proof of their betrayal. And your father's final, damning testament. Her hand trembled as she held it out to Elias. He trusted me to keep it safe. And I did. But now it's time for the truth to come to light. As Elias reached for the satchel, a sudden blinding flash erupted from the window behind Agnes, followed by the distant, sharp report of a gunshot. The force of it shattered the parlor glass, sending shards glittering across the room like deadly diamonds. Agnes cried out, stumbling backward, a dark stain blossoming on her white blouse as she clutched her chest. "They're here," she gasped, her eyes wide with terror and a horrifying dawning realization. "They knew you were coming." The satchel slipped from her grasp, falling to the floor with a soft thud, just as the front door of the house splintered inward, ripped from its hinges by an unseen force. A cold, determined draft swept through the house, carrying with it the scent of wet earth and something metallic, something utterly menacing. The phantom touch of Agnes's hand still burned on Elias's arm, a fiery brand of her previous confession. He stood transfixed, the parlor air, already thick with dust and unspoken histories, now vibrating with the sheer weight of her words. His father was murdered. The proof exists. She kept it all. You kept them? Elias's voice was a raw whisper, barely audible over the frantic thrumming in his ears. The letters? My father's letters? Agnes retreated slightly, her eyes, though clouded with age, held a fierce, unwavering light. She moved with a contained energy Elias hadn't noticed before, belying her frail appearance. She walked to an old, tarnished silver tea set on a small table, picked up a damp cloth, and meticulously began polishing a spoon, her movements slow, deliberate, a nervous tick betraying her outward calm. The faint rasp of metal on metal was the only sound for a long moment, a stark counterpoint to the unspoken chaos that swirled between them. Not just his letters, Mr. Thorne, she finally said, her voice softer now, more distant, as if recounting a dream. All of them. The ones that spoke without speaking. The ones that screamed when they were meant to whisper. She set the spoon down, a glint of defiance in her gaze. But before I tell you where or why, you must understand how I came to know what I know. What I did. She gestured towards the worn armchair opposite her own. Elias sank into it, his legs suddenly weak, the faded velvet cool against his trembling hands. He watched her, this woman who had lived a quiet life on the periphery, now revealing herself as a sentinel standing guard over buried truths. Agnes settled back, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, the polished spoon forgotten. I never went to university, Mr. Thorne. My schooling ended early. But I had a certain aptitude. For patterns. For logic. My father, God rest him, used to say I could find a needle in a haystack blindfolded, just by knowing how hay behaves. When I started at the post office, it was like being given 1,000 haystacks a day. Her gaze drifted to the window, where the last slivers of twilight were being swallowed by an encroaching, unnatural darkness. Every letter, every parcel, every official communique that passed through this town, passed through my hands. I learned the rhythm of communication, the subtle shifts in tone when news was bad, the unspoken anxieties tucked between the lines of a cheerful postcard. I taught myself to read not just the words but the spaces between them. The postal codes, the return addresses, the dates. They were all pieces of a larger puzzle. A cold knot formed in Elias's stomach. He was listening to the reluctant oracle of a forgotten war. Then came the drafts, Agnes continued, her voice tightening perceptibly. And with them my brother Thomas. He was so young, so full of spirit. 18. He was assigned to Echo Company. And that's when the letters started to change. Her eyes, now fixed on Elias, held a profound sorrow, edged with a flicker of old fear. I began to notice things. Small things at first. A letter from a wife to her husband in Echo Company, talking about a cold snap, despite it being the height of summer. Another from a mother, asking if her son had received the new boots she'd sent, when I knew she'd sent food parcels. Seemingly innocuous, but they jarred against the official reports of morale and conditions I also handled. She leaned forward, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. I realized they were using codes. Civilian codes, born of necessity and love, meant to slip past censors. But I was the censor in a way. And I started to cross-reference them with the local military mail. Dispatches from command, supply requisitions, troop movements. It was like two separate narratives were unfolding. One, an official story of a well-supplied, victorious campaign. The other, pieced together from wives' anxious pleas and mothers' subtle warnings, painted a picture of dire shortages, reckless orders, and escalating casualties for Echo Company specifically. Elias felt a growing dread. This wasn't just observation. This was an active investigation by a woman no one would suspect. They were being sacrificed, Agnes murmured, her voice raw with conviction. Echo Company. They were being deliberately put in harm's way, given impossible orders, denied crucial support. And I knew Thomas was among them. My little brother, who always brought me wildflowers. Her eyes glistened, but no tears fell. I couldn't just stand by, Mr. Thorne. Not with Thomas there. Not with so many sons and husbands. Here it was. The controversial core. So I acted, she stated, her chin lifting defiantly. I used my position. I started redirecting letters. Not randomly. I ensured that letters containing veiled warnings from families of Echo Company soldiers found their way to other companies' families. I thought, if enough people saw the patterns, if enough people started to question, then someone higher up might listen. Elias's breath hitched. This was beyond what he could have imagined. She was a silent saboteur, a ghost in the machine. I also delayed some official communications, Agnes confessed, her gaze unwavering. Orders that I knew from my deciphered warnings would send Echo Company into an avoidable ambush. Supply requests that were being deliberately ignored, I misplaced or rerouted until they became too critical to ignore. It was small acts, Mr. Thorne. Tiny adjustments to the flow of information. But sometimes a ripple can become a wave. Her actions, Elias realized with a jolt, were not merely unethical, they were treasonous by the strict letter of the law. Yet, her motivation, her desperate attempt to save lives, painted a complex, morally ambiguous picture. She was a whistleblower, yes, but also a covert operative, an agent of chaos in the postal service. And the anonymous letters? Elias pressed, needing to connect her story to his father's. My doing, she admitted, a shadow of weariness crossing her face. I crafted them. After I realized the civilian codes weren't enough, and my redirecting only created confusion, I tried a more direct approach. I used what I knew, the patterns, the codes, the truth. I sent them to officials, to journalists, to anyone I thought might have the power to intervene. I made them coded too, hoping to bypass the initial dismissals. I wrote warnings about misplaced loyalties, about sacrifices made for profit, about wolves in sheep's clothing. I tried to sound the alarm without exposing myself. And my father? Elias asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Arthur Thorne. What did he uncover that made him a target for these same wolves? Agnes's eyes narrowed, a cold fire replacing the earlier sorrow. Your father was an intelligent man, Mr. Thorne. A good man. He was high enough in command to see the entire picture, not just the fragments I pieced together from letters. He began to investigate the extraordinary casualty rates of Echo Company. He saw the discrepancies in official records, the falsified reports. He saw the threads I tried to weave with my warnings, and he pulled on them. She paused, taking a slow, shaky breath. He started communicating with me through his letters. Not directly, of course, but he knew somehow that I was listening. He understood the language of the spaces too. He confirmed my fears. He gathered the definitive proof. Proof that didn't just implicate negligent command, but deliberate, calculated betrayal. A conspiracy that extended far beyond the battlefield. A conspiracy rooted in greed, Mr. Thorne. Pure, unadulterated greed at the cost of human lives. The revelation hit Elias like a physical blow. Greed. Not just strategic blunders or incompetence, but malicious, intentional sacrifice for profit. The darkness Agnes spoke of was not merely the absence of light, but an active, consuming malevolence. And the powerful person? Elias pressed, a chill spreading through him. The one still alive? Agnes's gaze hardened, locking onto Elias's. The architect. The one who orchestrated it all, who signed off on the orders that condemned Echo Company. Your father's final letter, the one I finally deciphered, it names him. It lays bare his entire scheme. And it exposes the deep roots of his power, roots that still hold this entire region captive. Roots that will crush anyone who threatens to expose them. She stood up, her frail frame radiating an unexpected strength. She walked over to a heavy wooden desk in the corner, her fingers trailing over its dusty surface. They searched this house, Mr. Thorne, years ago. After your father's death. They knew someone had a copy or knew too much. They never found anything. Because they didn't know what they were looking for. And they certainly didn't know where to look. Agnes reached beneath the desk, her fingers fumbling with something hidden from view. A soft click echoed in the silence. Elias watched, his heart pounding, as she pulled out a false bottom. Inside lay a small leather-bound satchel, looking surprisingly pristine despite the age of its hiding place. This is it, she whispered, her voice barely audible. Everything. The coded warnings, the altered documents, the proof of their betrayal. And your father's final, damning testament. Her hand trembled as she held it out to Elias. He trusted me to keep it safe. And I did. But now it's time for the truth to come to light. As Elias reached for the satchel, a sudden, blinding flash erupted from the window behind Agnes, followed by the sharp, distant report of a gunshot. The force of it shattered the parlor glass, sending shards glittering across the room like deadly diamonds. Agnes cried out, stumbling backward, a dark stain blossoming on her white blouse as she clutched her chest. "They're here," she gasped, her eyes wide with terror and a horrifying, dawning realization. "They knew you were coming." The satchel slipped from her grasp, falling to the floor with a soft thud, just as the front door of the house splintered inward, ripped from its hinges by an unseen force. A cold, determined draft swept through the house, carrying with it the scent of wet earth and something metallic, something utterly menacing. The world exploded into a cacophony of sound and shattered light. The crack of the sniper's shot still echoed in the small parlor, a phantom thrum against Elias's eardrums, but it was the splintering impact of the front door that seized his gut. Agnes, eyes wide with the horror of a wound she couldn't comprehend, stumbled, a crimson blossom spreading rapidly across her pristine white blouse, just above her heart. "They're here," she gasped again, a choked, wet sound, her gaze locking onto Elias with an intensity that burned through the terror. They knew. The leather satchel, Thomas's legacy, slipped from her limp fingers, landing with a soft thud on the worn rug. Elias lunged not for Agnes but for the falling truth. His hand closed around the satchel strap an instant before his eyes snapped back to Agnes, already sinking to her knees. "Agnes." His voice was raw, unfamiliar. He reached for her, his fingers brushing the warm, wet fabric of her blouse. The metallic tang of blood filled the air, thick and cloying. A shadowy figure loomed in the now gaping doorway, silhouetted against the pale afternoon sky, carrying something long and dark. The cold, determined draft that swept through the house wasn't just wet earth. It carried the scent of wet wool, damp leather, and the stark, chilling aroma of calculated violence. Agnes clutched her chest, her breath coming in ragged, desperate gasps. "Thomas, he wasn't not a deserter, Elias." Her voice was a strained whisper, each word a monumental effort. He was trying to expose them. A covert op within his own command. They were going to sacrifice Echo Company, use them as expendable pawns. He knew. Elias's mind reeled. Sacrifice? Expendable pawns? The words clawed at his sanity. He knelt beside her, his free hand pressing futilely against her wound, trying to staunch the flow, but it was already too late. Her eyes, clouded with pain, still held that fierce, urgent spark. "His letters not just warnings for the platoon," she choked, a thin stream of blood escaping her lips. "They were for me." Coded messages to leak details. He was using the post office as a dead drop. To get the truth out. The weight of her words settled on Elias like a shroud, chilling him to the bone. The anonymous letter writer. It wasn't just a childhood fantasy. It was a desperate, dangerous mission. Thomas hadn't just used the post office. He'd used Agnes. She, the kind, unassuming woman who'd simply processed mail, had unknowingly become an unwitting accomplice in his fight against corruption. The realization hit Elias with the force of a physical blow. Thomas had dragged Agnes into his war, and now she was paying the ultimate price. My interception's official comms, I warned the platoon. But I also found disturbing details about their intentions. She coughed, a shudder running through her. The higher-ups, they orchestrated it. An inside job. He was trying to bring it down. He left proof in the satchel. For you. For the world. Her grip on his arm tightened, then slackened. Her eyes, once so bright with resolve, dimmed, reflecting the terror in his own. Find the truth, Elias. Don't let them silence him. Don't let them win. Her hand slipped from his, falling to the floor with a soft finality. Her gaze fixed on a distant point, then faded entirely. Agnes was gone. Grief, sharp and sudden, tore through Elias. He had known her for only hours, but her courage, her quiet strength, had left an indelible mark. And now, she was just another victim of the monster his father had fought. The footsteps were closer now, heavy and deliberate, scraping against the wooden floorboards just beyond the parlor. They were inside. Elias had only seconds. He scrambled back, the satchel clutched tight, his gaze sweeping the room. The back window, overlooking a narrow alleyway. His only chance. He propelled himself toward it, ignoring the throbbing pain in his knee from the previous day. A quick glance back confirmed his fears. Two figures, their faces obscured by balaclavas, were advancing into the parlor, weapons raised. One of them paused, scanning the room, then his eyes fell on Agnes's still form. He's got the package, a gruff voice commanded. Don't let him get away. Elias didn't hesitate. He kicked at the old rotten window frame, splintering wood and glass. He scrambled through the jagged opening, tearing skin on a protruding shard, dropping into the damp, overgrown alley with a bone-jarring thud. The satchel dug into his ribs. He didn't look back. He ran. The alley was a labyrinth of overflowing bins and moss-covered brick, leading him away from the main street, away from the immediate threat. His lungs burned, his legs ached, but the frantic rhythm of his escape was punctuated by Agnes's dying words. Expendable pawns, higher-ups expose them. He ran until the sounds of pursuit faded, until his breath hitched and his vision blurred. He found temporary refuge behind a forgotten shed in a derelict garden, collapsing against the damp wood, adrenaline still coursing through him. His hands trembled as he fumbled with the satchel. He had to know. He had to understand. His fingers worked the clasp, revealing the meticulously organized contents. Sheaves of documents, official-looking but with cryptic annotations, printouts of intercepted communications, and tucked neatly beneath them, a single government-issued file. His heart hammered against his ribs as he pulled it out. The paper was crisp, the ink stark. He saw his father's name, Thomas Miller, emblazoned across the top. Beneath it, in chilling, undeniable black and white, were the words, Status, MIA, missing in action. Not deserter. Never deserter. A guttural cry tore from Elias's throat, a sound of pure anguish and rage. They hadn't just branded him a coward, they had orchestrated his disappearance. They had covered it up. The lie had poisoned his family, shattered his mother, left him with a phantom father. Thomas wasn't a traitor to his country. He was a martyr, a victim of its corruption. And Elias, now clutching the proof of his brother's sacrifice, knew he had just inherited the most dangerous, most explosive truth the nation had ever hidden. He was no longer just looking for answers. He was now a target. And the hunt had just begun. The guttural cry ripped from Elias's throat, a raw, primal sound that clawed at the night. Mia. Not deserter. Never deserter. The lie had festered, a poison in his family's veins, a stain on his father's name, all to protect what? His knuckles blanched as he gripped the file, the paper crinkling under the force. The rage was a living thing, searing through his veins, eclipsing even the grief. They hadn't just taken Thomas. They had rewritten history, twisting heroism into shame. He couldn't stay hidden. He had to show Agnes. She deserved this truth, even if it shattered her all over again. Stumbling to his feet, the world still a blur of adrenaline and fury, Elias retraced his steps, the documents clutched fiercely to his chest. Every shadow seemed to lengthen, every rustle of leaves a whispered threat. He was no longer just a son seeking answers. He was a custodian of a dangerous secret, and the hunters he now understood were not chasing a ghost. They were chasing him. He found Agnes huddled in the forgotten sitting room, her silhouette stark against the grimy windowpane, nursing a cold cup of tea. She looked up, her eyes, usually so guarded, now wide with a fragile hope, then a dawning dread as she saw the tempest raging in his face. "Elias? What is it? What have you found?" Her voice was a strained whisper, barely audible above the frantic thumping of his own heart. He didn't speak. He couldn't. He simply thrust the military file into her trembling hands. She looked at the cover, then down at the chilling words, "Status, MIA, missing in action." Agnes's breath hitched. A sound like a broken sob escaped her. She didn't cry. She just stared, her face emptying of all expression. Then slowly a fierce, protective fire ignited in her eyes. "MIA," she repeated, the word a benediction, a curse. "I knew it. I always knew it." Her hand, surprisingly steady, reached out, not to the file, but to caress the faded photograph of Thomas on the mantelpiece. "My boy. My brave, brave boy." Elias sank onto the worn armchair opposite her, the satchel sliding to the floor with a soft thud. "It wasn't just a lie, Agnes. It was a cover-up. A calculated deception to silence him." He pointed at the satchel. These are his. He was exposing them. War profiteering. Illegal orders. From a Colonel Maxwell Thorne. Agnes flinched, a sharp, involuntary movement. "Thorne?" she breathed, the name a bitter taste on her tongue. Maxwell Thorne. Decorated officer. Now the head of Thorne Defense Systems. One of the biggest contractors in the country. Her gaze hardened, locking onto Elias's. "I suspected it, Elias." Thomas spoke of King Thorne in his letters, always veiled, always careful. He said Thorne was untouchable, but that he was bleeding the country dry, profiting from the blood of others. "These documents," Elias continued, sifting through the sheaves, "they detail inflated contracts, substandard equipment, soldiers sent into impossible situations with faulty gear, all to line Thorne's pockets. And direct orders for operations that skirted international law, even crossed the line into outright war crimes, all rubber-stamped by Thorne." Agnes's eyes widened, a dawning horror creeping into them. "Then the break-in at your flat. It wasn't random, was it? They weren't looking for your letters. They were looking for his. For proof of what Thomas knew about Thorne." "Exactly," Elias affirmed, the pieces clicking into place with a horrifying precision. "They knew he was compiling evidence. They must have been trying to retrieve or destroy anything he might have sent home, or hidden, anything that connected Thorne to these atrocities." A heavy silence descended, filled with the unspoken weight of their shared danger. The phantom pursuers in the garden, the anonymous threats, it wasn't just about preserving Thomas's reputation. It was about protecting a vast criminal enterprise. Agnes stood, her gaze drifting to the window, lost in a distant memory. Her shoulders, usually stooped with grief, seemed to straighten, imbued with a strange, fierce resolve. "There's something else, Elias. Something I did. A final act of desperation, just before we lost him." Her voice was low, almost a confession. Elias felt a prickle of unease. "What is it?" She turned, her eyes meeting his, full of a raw conviction he hadn't seen in years. Thomas was meticulously documenting everything. The dates, the units, the specific illegal directives, the financial records linking back to Thorne. He'd made copies. Sent them to me little by little, coded, disguised within his letters home. Elias's jaw tightened. "And what did you do with them?" "I compiled them," she said, her voice gaining strength, "into one comprehensive packet. Everything he gave me. And I sent it to General Richard Pritchard." The name hit Elias like a physical blow. General Pritchard. The Silver Star recipient, known for his unyielding integrity, his public criticisms of military corruption, a man of legend within the armed forces. Pritchard? Why him? Elias asked, his mind reeling. Thomas revered him, Agnes explained. He knew Pritchard was one of the few who might actually listen, who would act. "I wrote an anonymous letter, detailing everything, the war profiteering, the illegal orders, how Thorne was behind it all, using Thomas's own words, his evidence. I sent it to Pritchard's private address, marked urgent and confidential. I prayed it would reach him, that it would expose Thorne and save other soldiers from Thomas's fate." Her voice trembled now, a fragile hope mixed with profound regret. "It was the last thing I did before the news came, before they declared Thomas a deserter. I never knew if it reached him. If it was enough. The air in the small room crackled with a newfound, terrifying energy. The conspiracy wasn't just about Thomas. It was about an entire system, and Agnes had thrown a live grenade into its very heart. Elias stared at his mother, seeing not just a grieving woman, but a formidable, desperate warrior. Agnes, he breathed, the full weight of her revelation crushing him. If that letter reached Pritchard, then he too is in danger. And if it fell into the wrong hands? Her eyes, usually so shadowed, now burned with a terrifying clarity. Then we are all in danger, Elias. The general. Me. We've awoken a monster. She paused, her gaze distant, as if seeing beyond the confines of the room, into the swirling currents of power and betrayal. But if it did reach him, if General Pritchard read it, then Thorne's worst nightmare isn't Thomas anymore. It's the truth. And we just handed him the match. A sudden, sharp rap echoed from the front door, a percussive shock that reverberated through the stillness of the house. Agnes's head snapped up, her breath catching. Elias instinctively pushed her behind him, his hand reaching for the only weapon he possessed, the heavy satchel containing Thomas's secrets. The rap came again, louder this time, insistent, followed by a voice, cold and authoritative, calling out into the night. Mrs. Miller? We know you're in there. We just want to talk. The insistent rap fractured the quiet night, a staccato assault that seized the air, holding Elias and Agnes suspended in a single, terrifying breath. It wasn't the tentative knock of a neighbor, nor the official rhythm of a law enforcement officer. This was a command, a declaration of presence that brooked no argument. Mrs. Miller? We know you're in there. We just want to talk. The voice, low and devoid of inflection, offered a chilling politeness that was more menacing than any shout. Elias shoved Agnes firmly behind him, the heavy satchel containing Thomas's secrets feeling less like a weapon and more like a flimsy shield. His heart hammered against his ribs, a drumbeat of primal fear and mounting rage. He crept to the front window, peering through a sliver in the old lace curtain. Two figures stood silhouetted against the pale glow of the street lamp, their suits dark, their postures rigid. They weren't in uniform, but their bearing spoke of a quiet, methodical authority that was far more insidious. No, he whispered, pulling back, his hand shaking slightly. They're not police. Not local. These are something else. His gaze locked with Agnes's, wide and desperate. You can't be here. Not now. We need to go. Agnes, surprisingly, found a flicker of steel in her eyes. Where, Elias? Where do we go where they won't find us? But even as she spoke, the second, more insistent rap sounded, rattling the old door in its frame. Back door. Now. Elias grabbed her arm, pulling her towards the kitchen. He fumbled with the deadbolt, shoving the protesting wood open just enough for them to squeeze through. The cool night air rushed in, a sharp contrast to the suffocating dread within the house. He didn't look back. There was no time for sentiment, only survival. He didn't know where he left Agnes, a frantic drop-off at a distant, anonymous motel on the outskirts of town, with a desperate promise to return. Her face, a mask of terror and bewildered resignation, haunted him even as he pressed the accelerator, the engine whining in protest. He was a man consumed, driven by the cold certainty that the only way to protect her, to protect Thomas's memory, was to face the monster head-on. The Maxwell Thorne estate was a fortress of polished granite and manicured lawns, a monument to a life forged from ambition and, as Elias was beginning to suspect, betrayal. The air was thick with the scent of expensive roses and old money, a stark contrast to the dust and despair that had clung to Thomas's forgotten letters. Elias, dressed in a borrowed suit that felt stiflingly formal, presented himself at the imposing oak doors, the book research, ruse his only passport into this rarefied world. A crisply uniformed assistant led him through silent halls, past an impressive collection of abstract art and ancestral portraits, to Thorne's private study. Maxwell Thorne, an edifice of white hair and tailored tweed, sat behind a mahogany desk that could have served as an aircraft carrier. He rose as Elias entered, extending a hand that was surprisingly soft, yet firm. His smile was benign, his eyes, however, held a glint of the predator that time could not fully extinguish. Mr. Miller, Thorne's voice was a low, resonant purr. I've been looking forward to our chat. Always pleased to support aspiring historians, especially when they're delving into such pivotal moments in our nation's history. Vietnam, you said? A generation defined by fire. Elias forced a smile, his stomach churning. Indeed, Mr. Thorne. I'm particularly interested in the unsung heroes, the quiet acts of courage often overlooked. Your name, of course, came up repeatedly. Your unit's tactical genius during the 68 offensive legendary. He watched Thorn carefully, searching for any flicker beneath the polished surface. Thorn chuckled, a dry, rustling sound. Legend is often a kinder word for necessity, Mr. Miller. We did what had to be done. Sometimes the truly heroic acts are those that remain unseen, unknown for the greater good. He leaned back, his gaze sharpening slightly. But you're not here just for anecdotes, are you? I sense a deeper current in your questions. Elias took a deep breath, steeling himself. There's a particular incident I've been trying to piece together, Mr. Thorn. A young man, a private first-class Thomas Miller, went MIA during your command's operations shortly after the 68 offensive. His family, they never got closure. Elias paused, letting the name hang in the air, a silent challenge. Thorn's smile didn't waver, but his eyes narrowed imperceptibly. He steepled his fingers, tapping them together. Miller, Thomas Miller. The name rings a faint bell. Many men went missing in that quagmire, Mr. Miller. A tragedy, every single one of them. His tone was dismissive, almost weary. But I must caution you, young man. Digging up old ghosts can sometimes awaken more than you bargained for. Some truths, no matter how painful, are best left undisturbed. For the stability of the system, you understand. The very fabric of national security sometimes relies on carefully maintained silence. Elias's jaw tightened. This was it. The veiled threat, the confirmation. Thorn was involved. He pressed on, his voice low, tinged with controlled fury. But what if the silence is a lie, Mr. Thorn? What if it's not about the greater good, but about covering a grave injustice? Thorn's demeanor shifted, subtly, dangerously. The philanthropic mask thinned, revealing a colder, more calculating intellect. Injustice? You speak in such absolutes, Mr. Miller. Let me tell you about absolutes. Thomas Miller was a liability. A soldier with dangerous ideals, a loose cannon who believed his personal moral compass superseded command decisions. He was not MIA, Mr. Miller. He was contained. The word hung in the air, chilling and precise. Elias felt a cold dread crawl up his spine, but he fought to keep his expression neutral. Contained? Thorn leaned forward, his voice dropping to an almost confidential whisper, yet radiating a terrible power. He threatened exposure. To the media, to international observers, perhaps even to certain well-meaning but naive politicians. He had information and he planned to use it. Information that would have crippled our efforts, undermined morale, and painted us as the villains. We couldn't let that happen. Not when the entire operation, indeed, the stability of an entire region, hung in the balance. He paused, his gaze boring into Elias. So, no, he wasn't MIA. He was executed. By my men. A necessary sacrifice. To prevent his exposure. To ensure the mission's integrity. Elias felt a white-hot rage explode within him, threatening to consume his carefully constructed composure. Thomas. Executed. Not lost, not a deserter, but murdered. His brother. Thorn watched him, a slight, almost imperceptible smirk playing on his lips. And his mother, Thorn continued as if reading Elias's mind. Agnes, wasn't it? A persistent woman. Naive but persistent. She wrote letters, didn't she? To anyone who would listen. To General Pritchard, to other officials. Trying to unravel things she couldn't possibly comprehend. A veritable oracle of misplaced outrage. Elias's blood ran cold. Thorn knew about Agnes. He knew about the letters. We intercepted quite a few of them, Thorn mused, almost conversationally. Not all, mind you. She was clever, the oracle. Used back channels, obscure addresses. But we kept an eye on her. Couldn't quite pin her down on the official mail tampering, but we had our suspicions. Such actions, you understand, carry rather severe penalties. Especially during wartime. Or when national security is invoked. Thorn's smile widened, a thin, chilling line. It would be a tragedy for such a devoted mother to face prosecution, wouldn't it? For attempting to interfere with official government communications. A real pity. The room seemed to spin around Elias. The casual cruelty, the absolute impunity, the explicit threat against his mother, it was a suffocating weight. Thorn had not only admitted to Thomas's murder, but he was holding Agnes's freedom, perhaps her life, hostage. He had played Elias, confirming everything, then sealing his trap. Thorn leaned back, a victor surveying the battlefield. "I trust our conversation has been illuminating, Mr. Miller. Perhaps you'll find a new direction for your book. One that understands the nuances of true heroism and the necessary sacrifices for the greater good. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have a board meeting." He waved a dismissive hand, a silent command for Elias to leave. Elias stumbled out, the opulent surroundings blurring into an oppressive cage. He had his answers. Far worse than he could have ever imagined. Thomas was gone, butchered to protect a lie. And now Agnes, his fierce, desperate mother, was in Thorne's crosshairs. Elias was caught, exposed, and utterly alone in a game far deadlier than he'd ever conceived. He had awoken the monster. And the monster was now looking directly at him.